Before we dive in, quick announcement. Today's episode marks the start of a new season for The Deep End. In Season 2, we'll keep exploring ideas that matter, but with more chances for you, the audience, to get involved than ever before. In addition, from now on, we'll be moving to 2 episodes a week, every Monday and Wednesday morning. Our weekly Substack email will still be once a week, but will move to Thursdays. Sign up for our newsletter at thedeepend.substack.com.
By design, every Web 3.0 company has an open source protocol, which also means to go into Web 3.0, to be part of the future of web, you need to be open source if you're not. So if you think of all the companies who don't have their source code open, it will be almost impossible for them to make the wedge, to make the jump into Web 3.0. But one day, who knows, a blockchain, let's say Ethereum or Solana or some other blockchain, is efficient enough for us to run actually the whole infrastructure decentralized, the way Filecoin is fully decentralized. I think that's gonna be an amazing day for everyone in our team and community.
The Deep End for creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in depth into ideas that inspire people to build. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of internet communities, creator tools, climate tech, longevity, and much, much more. There are no experts in uncharted territory, only pioneers. The Deep End invites these trailblazers to turn their experiences into knowledge and ideas that others need to start their own founder odyssey. I want to take this chance to thank you, our listeners, for being such an enthusiastic audience throughout our first 21 episodes. Your insight has been instrumental in shaping the show. We hope you can continue to come to our live events and show your support for the show by letting us know what you learned from the episodes on Twitter, in the YouTube comments, and on the Apple Podcast review page. Joining me this week in the Deep End is Peer Richelsen. Peer is a former OnDeck fellow and teammate who is now the co-founder and co-CEO of Cal.com. That's CAL.com, an open source scheduling tool. Peer views the internet as a democratic, transparent, and open technology that is currently undergoing a renaissance. Open source software development was the spiritual precursor to 2021's Web3 boom. Tinkerers like Peer are ecstatic that technologists are returning to the very fundamentals of the web that made it so inclusive and exciting in the early 2000s. In this episode, Peer explains how the internet can finally return to its decentralized roots because of the incentive structures that developed over the last few years. We also dive into several fun other topics, including how to pick the right web domain, how to build a company of 2 CEOs, and what the differences in cultures of compensation transparency are between the US and Germany. The Deep End is produced by OnDeck, where top talent goes on to accelerate their ideas and careers. We hope that those who listen to the ideas on the show are inspired to build. To learn more about OnDeck's programs, visit beondeck.com. For show notes and additional resources related to The Deep End, check out thedeepend.substack.com. Peer Richelsen, welcome to The Deep End.
Hello, hi. Hey, Marshall. Great to meet you.
Great to meet you too. Let's talk about calendars. It's the type of subject where 2.5 years ago, I wouldn't have had any thinking about whatsoever. But increasingly, I think myself and every single part of the audience, especially people who work in the tech spaces, are going to be stuck with a lot of emails, different applications, different parts there. So what got you into the calendar scheduling space in the first place?
Right. Yeah, I think I use my calendar more than email nowadays. I have most of my conversations on Slack or direct messages. So I think the reason why I got into this business is actually surprisingly out of my own requirements. So before joining OnDeck, I was head of product at OnDeck for about 7 months. I was working on leanhire.com, which is a hiring marketplace now run by OnDeck for contractors to become full-time employees after the trial phase. So, and for that business, we were using like a SaaS scheduling product. And that was just not enough for us because we wanted to make, changes to the design and the API, like the workflow, everything. And we also didn't have like any insights if a booking happened, or if it was rescheduled or canceled. So that's kind of like out of my own necessity. We were looking into options. And so I went on Google and was like, Calendly open source, and there's just no results, right? So there wasn't really any hits. And then we decided to spin out Calendso as an open source alternative. Yeah, and that was basically the start of this crazy journey. So that's kind of like what got me into scheduling and calendars. But I've been in tech for like the last 10 years, so I've obviously always used my calendar for everything, for my private things, but also for my business things. And yeah, it's great to be now being able to build like a core piece of web infrastructure with like a really big focus on open source.
Why the focus on open source?
So open source has many, many benefits. I'm a big fan of taking the tool that does the job the best. If you think of cryptocurrencies or blockchain and all that, you should not use a tool just because it sounds funky or fancy. You should use it because it's literally the best for the job. And for us, it is. Open source is the best that we can do for making scheduling accessible for everyone. It means that anyone can use the product, spin it up themselves. You have full authority over the data. You have full authority over the design, the layout. You can make any changes. And that's something you can only do with open source. I mean, when you think of SaaS, software as a service, you're renting a license. You're renting your access, essentially. Whereas open source, not only you, but everyone owns the code. It's a public good in a way where anyone can contribute, anyone can make changes, and at the end of the day, everyone owns a piece of it in a sense. So for us, scheduling is really important to a point where we want to build infrastructure for, let's say, telehealth medicine companies, or even for On Deck to connect fellows and or fellows and experts. And that needs to be open. There should not be a single point of failure in between these core interactions that we have every day on the web.
Could you help paint a stronger picture for me because I'm your most basic calendar user. So what are the failure points in a closed system versus the open model you're discussing?
Yeah. Well, obviously uptime is a concern, when companies of a certain size have hundreds of thousands of bookings. Every time there's a downtime or they don't have, full authority over the server infrastructure, it becomes a business risk. A day of downtime is probably a couple million in lost revenue if you're in the scheduling space. But also, I think just the raw fact that you're not sharing your data with anyone else other than your own database. It's communications data. So who meets? If you're a VC firm, let's say, I wouldn't want to open my deal flow to a third party. It's my core IP, who I'm meeting and how many times, at what time, how long, who's joining. That information is really, really critical for everyone who's running a sensitive business. So that's where open source shines, and also being able to be public about the fact that there's no backdoor, we're not selling data, we can't literally sell data, there's no nothing baked into the product that you're not aware of. Everything's open. People can do their own due diligence on their own time.
I like how you talked about open source shining. Let me ask you to put a different hat on for anyone who's listening. Peer's actually wearing a hat, so that's not just metaphorical in this case. Where historically hasn't open source shined? Yeah,
that's a very good point that I talked to with an advisor today. A lot of open source, first off, open source is as old as the web, or even older. If we think of Linux and Ubuntu and even Docker and all the new generation of open source. I think for the longest time, open source was viewed as kind of like a hobby or side thing or not legitimate business. A lot of open source companies haven't been really taken serious in the past. But I mean, then we've obviously seen like infrastructure companies like MongoDB or so go public, which kind of like broaden the attention for others to take them serious. But I think what most of the time open source hasn't shined is design, user experience, and focus on the customer. Because if you think about a lot of open source companies, or not companies, a lot of open source projects, they grow organically. They have an idea, they start with an initial core, and then someone from like around the world, people join in and build things, and that can become a mess if you're not ahead of it, because someone adds the button on the top right, and then someone else adds another button on the top left, and everything becomes we've all seen some of the open source products out there which are just not really user friendly, just to call it that. So one thing we did as the literally first hire for our company was to hire a product designer, senior product designer, to go really deep and think about our first design system, but also how interaction should look like. And we've actually open sourced or opened up our design references, like our design system. It's design.cal.com. So anyone else who wants to contribute to the project need to follow the design guides. So that means suddenly, instead of having like a patchwork of hundreds of people who are committing, have a very consistent product with very consistent UI, very consistent user experience. And I think that's what also companies like Supabase have been doing to really show, hey, a legitimate product can be built in open source, even though there's potentially hundreds of people working on it.
Could you talk a bit about the tension between running a company and then doing something that's open source? So there's been references to community, but obviously you're creating a company, you raise money. Just talk about operationalizing it, because the thing that was really interesting in your initial explanation of why folks are sometimes down on open source is you said that they see it as a hobby, but running the business is obviously not a hobby. So talk about that part.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we, as very few companies, have decided to have a CoCEO structure, like a dual CEO structure, in a sense where I'm the commercial co-CEO and Bailey, my co-founder, is the technical developer-focused CEO. So at its core, most or kind of every open source company is building both kind of like a non-profit foundation and the commercial company that uses the like open source foundation, the work of the open source foundation. So we decided very early on that both things are of equal importance. Like you can't build the commercial product without the underlying openness of the code base, and you can't build a product for the next 10 years without the commercial side, which gives you funding and resources and hires and continuous support and upgrades. So when you have an open source company that just requires a lot of attention, you see a lot of burnout in the open source community when people are not donating or they're not becoming patrons. And then there's like this solo engineer who has been running this open source project with 20,000 stars over the last 2 or 3 years, but they just don't have the resources to properly hire, properly build a product, build a team. So for us, it was very important from the day one that we have both the commercial side, which I'm kind of leading, and then the open source developer focused foundational side, which Bailey's taking care of. So I don't think co-CEOs are common, like co-CEO structures, but I think for especially open source companies who kind of build two organizations at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. And as long as we both are very clear about who's doing what, it'll probably work out fine. So that's kind of like how we think of the company at the moment.
Yeah, here's hoping on the working out part. Can you speak a little more about how this operationalizes itself, especially along the lines of the nonprofit side, because you're talking about community members donating, participating. What does that actually look like, and how do you factor those interactions into the overall business?
Yeah. So we don't actually have a lot of donations. We very early on decided that donations is not a sustainable business model. It's more like continuous fundraising. And if everyone has been in tech, that's usually not a good idea to build a business if you're continuously fundraising. So yeah, we don't actually have donations, but we have obviously a paid pro plan, which if you don't want to, self-host and you're not really interested in owning all of the benefits of, you just want to have a cal.com/Marshall or /peer link, then you'll be able to pay $12 per month as a pure SaaS business. So operationally wise, yeah, of course we have about almost 1,000 developers, or like 800 developers in our Slack who need to be taken care of, like support and everything. So that's very interesting, going from a handful of people to almost 1,000. That's very, very tough. So we hired a community manager who's helping out. Other than that, operationally wise, just staying ahead of all the bugs and things that break at scale. I think that's the core part of our operations right now. And then obviously looking into commercial use cases for enterprise companies or foundations, like big organizations who want to run scheduling. Essentially, that's kind of like the day-to-day business.
What's interesting here is, as someone who's coming from outside the open source community, or frankly any deep online community here, the idea of 800 people working on something like this is a lot to take in, and I'm sure it is for a lot of listeners. Can you speak about, how do you find 800 people who want to work on a project like this, right? Because I think the reason why we're rooting the conversation in open source in the Cal conversation is, it's not as if you're saying, hey, here's this crypto DAO that is going to revolutionize Web3, NFTs, speculation reference. How does the process of actually building a community in a space that's deeply important but not exactly sexy work?
Yeah, wow. I mean, first, to get this straight, not everyone in the Slack has yet contributed to our product. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are reporting bugs, which at the end of the day is also contributions. But it's not like 800 people are simultaneously pushing code updates. That would be mental. I think we would completely break down and cry if that would be the case at our small size of a team. No, I mean, people join just out of curiosity, and obviously the open source community has so much more to offer than just writing code. We have a lot of people who just want to translate, who want to translate English to Russian or Spanish or Italian or French. Then there's people who want to write documentation, who want to just clean up issues, like add labels to certain PRs to make it easier for someone to read. So the great thing about open source is there's pretty much no expectations, and every minor thing is great. Like fixing a typo in a README or so. It's just about, like, when I remember when I got started in tech about 10 years ago, that I got my hands on WordPress. Like I downloaded the zip somewhere. I didn't even know of Git. Like I didn't know what Git was, and I opened up the code base, and first I didn't understand a single line of code, like it was just so many things and everything was kind of like, what is this? But as you set it up yourself and you slowly touch a few files and you make some changes, you're like, your first realization is, how is this free? Like, why did someone just give this to me for free? And the second is, this makes a lot of sense. Let me write a simple function that does this thing that I want for my blog or something, So you start changing bits, you start changing the CSS, you start changing the HTML, the templates and everything. So, and then you slowly adopt, and maybe at some point you build your own plugin. for me, that was eye-opening to see that there's this massive community of WordPress, and also it was kind of like educating the next generation of engineers. It's people run hackathons to build stuff for open source, and that was really cool. So in a sense, it was my first touch point. I mean, most engineers' first experience are in open source. You just clone something and break it apart. And it's really cool to now see the same interest in our community where people propose integrations, or they build, like one of our core contributors built the Stripe integration like on his own, and then we hired them, So just because it's great that you see that impact, and then we reach out to that person and be like, hey, do you want to work on this in full time? Like, you seem really interested. And then a week later they join your team, and I think that's kind of like the spirit of this open and transparent culture where everyone can collaborate and work on it. And then if you want to do more, you can just join the core team and get actually paid for working in public, which is great.
So speaking of the customizable open aspects of this, can you give some more examples to make it tangible? Because once again, for most people who are listening, I'm sure the depths of their experience is, hey, Calendly works pretty well. Insert thing from Google works pretty well. You're probably not a VC with proprietary information. So help understand how that could, because once again, the key, and by the way, I like your mission tagline on the website, which is connecting 1 billion people by 2031 through calendar scheduling. It seems to be the inherent or implicit argument here is that the open parts of this system, the customizable parts, are what's actually going to help you get to, once again, a huge hypothetical percentage of the population. So just speak to how everyday people who aren't top tier VCs or people with direct proprietary information could think of how it's useful.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to the point of WordPress where like PHP, if you ever talk to anyone, like no one's using PHP for like if you start a new company. However, it has like 90% market share of I guess it's 90% or 80% or some horrendous big number of market share on the web. And that is primarily due to WordPress being still so actively in use by so many people. I think I need to look into the numbers, but at least 1 billion websites running on WordPress. So they, and that's just the websites, right? So imagine how many eyeballs the technology of WordPress has. It's probably in the trillions, trillion of views of eyeballs have touched the WordPress code base. So at its core, you can only reach the sheer depth of adoption when you have something that is so open and free in a sense as well, free available for anyone to be, working with. And the same argument could be made with let's say web agencies. Back in the days, if you had a request I want my website, the web agency would use WordPress. Now, if you say, hey, I'm a yoga teacher or a personal trainer, I need scheduling, everything's on the web. You probably go for the open source alternative, right? It's just more accessible. It's open. I can make changes. I can resell it. I can tap into the big ecosystem of developers. So I think you can only reach the size and the scale, like as you said, like the 1 billion people that we want to connect, if you have something that is just a commodity, like just something that completely it becomes a no-brainer to use, very simple to set up, very easy to make changes, and it becomes the email type of protocol. Email has touched billions of people. WhatsApp has. Just very simple, very accessible, and very free. That's how we think of scheduling.
I'm so glad you brought up the WordPress example because it's helping me better conceptualize the point you're making. Because, as any non-technical person who's worked for organizations will tell you, you just run into WordPress. I come from the media background and everything's run on WordPress, and no one likes WordPress. We all hate WordPress. But as you are pointing out, there are just inherent reasons why it is just the standard, for good or for ill, that folks use. And it seems within the history you're describing, it's because to a certain degree, it was the default option. That's what things built. The customizable part was huge. How does that type of, and same thing with email too. How does that type of story inform how you think about a calendar, right? Because if you think about it for a second, email, total normie, I'm logging onto the internet with Windows 95, Internet Explorer, or Netscape, AOL, whatever, in 1995. Email, that's why I use email. I don't think about it. It's just the default thing. WordPress, hey, I want to launch a news website. The web developer says, hey, use WordPress. It's simple. It's easy. You use it yourself. How does that work in your context?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we think of the web in a sense of, I mean, obviously we have centralized players like Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram who control core pieces of communications, right? Text and timelines. But then we also have email, which, I mean, obviously Google, like Gmail, has a massive, massive market share, but you can, like, it's still decentralized in a sense where if Google doesn't want you, like, if you don't want to make a Google account, you can spin up your own email server in a minute, like, or just go to your local cloud provider, get a domain, and get an inbox or something. So it's very, very accessible. Like, there's no one banning you from using that service. Whereas if you get banned on WhatsApp or firewalls, we talk about like some countries banning certain apps. Open protocols like open source and decentralized platforms pretty much are not able to be taken down because there's no centralized company to go after and block them. Like for us as Cal.com Inc., the startup that is running Cal, if we go bankrupt tomorrow, let's hope not, hope knock on wood, the company itself would die, but everything we've built would sustain, it would survive, like there's all this IP and the community and the developers who would sustain and build and continue to iterate on the product and make it grow. So in that regard, if we think about communications, and I fundamentally think, like, I'm a huge advocate of Signal. I still think Signal could do even more to be more open and transparent. But I'm a massive fan of open communications and in a sense, decentralized communications. Like you and me, we shouldn't be going through a company to be talking, in a sense, and we shouldn't also go through a company to make an appointment, right? So if you want to, you can have a Cal.com link, but if you say, no, I'm good, I'm running my own small barber shop, and I just want people to come through my web interface, that's perfectly fine, like that's the beauty of being open source and providing the source code for the public.
This is fascinating. So you just made a value statement where you said we shouldn't be going through a company. I'm not going to mention the name of our recording device because that'd be a weird time I'm not going to name which recording software we're not going to go through, which is like the I like this company, so I'm going to do an negative endorsement here. But if that's true, why hasn't open source, quote unquote, won? Or is even me thinking about that? Is me thinking about things in that context the wrong way of approaching it?
No, I mean, you make a valid point. There's strength in centralization. There's power in monopolies, right? And what we've seen in the past, whether it was freemium open source, like FOSS, free open source software, FOSS, it goes back to the point that building something at scale is really hard without resources. If you don't have, let's say, venture funding, it's really hard to build a multi-billion-dollar company, right? So if you have the funding and you keep the code close to your chest and it's all it's all closed source and you have 100% ownership and you can decide who's getting in, who's getting out, and how we charge them and change our pricing and ban people. it's much easier to enforce power over your market than if it's a small, freemium, like indie developer who just launched something open source. So I think the most explosive combinations of open source organizations and at the end of the day also open source projects is when you can fit both, like the venture sized backed company with resources and engineers on staff, head of lead designers, kind of like GitLab. GitLab is going to IPO. They just filed their S1, right? So that's, for me, is just inspiring to see such a massive company that is used by government entities or mega enterprise companies while still having this culture of everything's open. They open source their playbooks, their company cultures, and everyone, can look into the code base and copy and make changes. And it's really accessible for engineers. So in a sense, that's what really drives massive adoption when you have both. You can sustain your company you can sustain the community with the commercialization of your product.
Something, since you referenced open, and y'all, actually, I want to hit two different points here. You were just speaking about the long-term future of Cow.com. Once again, knocking on wood, nothing bad happens. But can you speak about the longevity guarantee, which you seem to be referring to? Just the actual structure, because this was a concept I'd never really thought of before. And I think it's interesting just to hear operationally what that means. And just to pull a quick line from your website copy, Cow.com is built for the future of the web. We believe that code is abundant and should be owned by both everyone and no one, which leads into the longevity guarantee and that underlying idea there. So it'd be great to hear you expand on that and how people should think about that, especially given the open nature of the conversation.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, with open source, the train has passed to get rid of the code, there's a concept called forks on GitHub for those non-technical listeners. If you fork a project, you create a copy of that code base, right? So you fork it away, and then at some point, if you make changes, you can merge it back into the main product. So for us, even if we tried, the damage has been done. The code is there. Everything's there. We can't take it back. There's no takey backsy. So even if we wanted to, with all the lawyer budget in the world, we couldn't get rid of the code base that we've created. I think that's very inspiring to anyone who wants to use scheduling for the next 5-10 years, knowing that they will never lose access to the core piece of their business, if it's scheduling, like a barber shop or a yoga teacher or a personal trainer or a big enterprise company that does hundreds of thousands of bookings a year. So I think that's very, by design, that's longevity. But we actually went a step further and outlined that in the rare event that the company doesn't make it, or not even doesn't make it, but we may at some point pivot into something that maybe even more exciting, which I don't really see down the road. But let's say every one of our engineers, stops working on this. We want to create an open foundation, just a nonprofit that overtakes kind of authority on this project. So we would fund it with donations, just public non-profit donations, but also we would staff correctly and hand over access to the GitHub repository, which at the end of the day decides what type of code comes in, what type of code gets out. So yeah, we have these agreements in place. We would love to, obviously never think about this case happening, but I think for anyone who looks into software, I think this is just going to be, for any open source company, it is the default, right? There's no going back. Even if, if worst things worst, both of our founders and the team, dies in a flight accident. Again, knock on wood, nothing happens, but let's hope it doesn't happen. But it would still be relatively fine. So I think most companies, I can count probably 10 companies right now where when the founder dies, everything crashes. That's not the case for us. in that sense. So I think that's beautiful.
I'm incredibly superstitious, so I really hope we haven't jinxed this entire recording. But I want to get to
I won't be taking flights
I'm
anytime
really
soon.
knocking on wood here. I really liked, I guess I'm the target market for everything you all do, because I liked the copy when you talk about, as part of the longevity guarantee, building for the future of the web.
Right.
And we've kind of danced around it throughout this conversation, but I would just love to hear your articulation of what that future could look like, does look like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because as you said, you've been in this space for more than 10 years. We're noticing with the podcast itself, there's deep, deep, deep interest with folks on the Web 2 to Web 3 transition. So this is actually a really useful time to think about. Let me put it a better way. The term future of web means way more in 2021 than it would have in 2015. I wouldn't have asked a question about it specifically given that copy. So we'd just love to hear I'm sure you have some type of vision, more expansive bit there. We'd love to hear that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's what everyone's kind of going through, looking at all the downsides of Web 2.0, which kind of, this times of social media, the times of centralized, like really centralized monopoly power on the web. I mean, the web started out as a decentralized, network of websites. And within 5 years or 10 years, we've consolidated all of the traffic into like 3 companies or so. I mean, AWS, I don't know what market share they cover off the web. So I think if we truly think of the future of web, that is kind of going back to its roots, I mean, the future is kind of like what the web was intended to be connecting people and making it open and accessible for everyone. Like it was by its core a network where you didn't need permission. It's permissionless information. You don't need to ask someone to do something. It's kind of like the whole thesis of startups as well, to dodge the gatekeepers. So I think if people refer to the future of web, that means going back to the core values of being open and accessible. So in that regard, we're really, really at the edge of Web 3.0. We're not decentralized in the sense of our backend still runs on cloud and we have a paid plan. But I think what I'm really excited about, and obviously the future is called the future because it's not there yet, is blockchains that are really efficient for us to run scheduling in a decentralized way, where you could come up with a calendar protocol which runs decentralized, fully encrypted. Who knows what Google Calendar is reading in your calendar events, what they're using with their data, or Microsoft or someone else. So really going back to the core of how can we build a protocol like email, which is at its core decentralized, but then also be able to protect it. And that was the missing piece of Web 2.0. We couldn't protect the decentralization. We couldn't protect companies from taking over protocols and building their applications on top. But now with the Web 3.0 technologies of incentives, like incentivizing engineers to keep it decentral, not even engineers, whole organizations, like decentralized, like DAOs and stuff. Suddenly you have a different power dynamic where it's actually economically incentivized to keep something decentralized. And that's something I'm really, really excited about to dive into in the next few months or years. It's not a core priority for us. Like our core intent is still to build, again, the open source and the commercial side of our business. But given that every Web 3.0 company is open source by design, like every cryptocurrency is open source. You can't make a cryptocurrency that's not open source, but like it's physically impossible for those who are just joining. A cryptocurrency is an open source project that is run on a range of different servers, right? So to launch a cryptocurrency or a blockchain, you need to be open source, right? So by design, every Web 3.0 company has an open source protocol, which also means to go into Web 3.0, to be part of the future of web, you need to be open source if you're not already. So if you think of all the companies who don't have their source code open, it will be almost impossible for them to make the jump into Web 3.0. They would probably not go out of business, but they won't reap the benefits of what the new web has to offer. So we're really excited that while we still work in we have a centralized server that runs the bookings, but one day, who knows, a blockchain, let's say Ethereum or Solana or some other blockchain, is efficient enough for us to run actually the whole infrastructure decentralized, the way Filecoin is fully decentralized. I think that's gonna be an amazing day for everyone in our team and community. We're very unlikely launching our own cryptocurrency just because I'm not a big fan of that. I'm not don't expect a Calcoin anytime soon. Please don't quote me on that in a few months. But we're really looking forward for what the scaling challenges will be, and run everything in a decentralized cloud.
You said a couple interesting things that I want to pull out. So one, you made the point that what's interesting about this space is that there are incentives at a structural level that would keep things decentralized, because what always interests me is the dynamic where oftentimes things centralize and that creates an opportunity to decentralize, but then it goes the other way around too. So you're making the point that looking at these spaces, there are actually worlds where there are incentives to keep things towards that direction, back towards that initial ambition that many folks had for the internet. And then two would just be this idea that I really want to get to before we get to the name change to tie everything together, which is just openness. I'd never come across. Seriously, I recommend everyone go to the Cal website. It's not overly expansive, but they're just interesting things there. I'd never heard of this open startup concept. So you go to it, and there's always information about your salary and what's really going on there. And the topic of this episode really is not just, calendar products, but openness on the internet. Could you talk to what attracted you to do that in the first place, and what the advantages are of running a startup that way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've seen a few more companies. Like, the concept of open startup is not really new. There's Nomad List or Remote OK, both run by Peter Levels, I think is his name. So that's, I'd say, some of the more interesting. Like, they have a lot more information than we have today. I mean, my job is to allocate enough data that I can make a lot of more fancy graphs, but I think I think Buffer is actually one of the biggest open startups. So if you heard of Buffer, it's I think it's a social media automation tool or so. And I think they have let me check after the episode, millions of revenue, and they show management executive salaries. So it's really interesting to see this change of transparency. I'm from Germany, and in our, I wouldn't say in our culture, but at least in the companies that I've worked for in the past, it was not a real problem to talk about your salary, right? It was okay. Whereas I've then joined other companies and worked in let's say in the US, and I talked to other founders, and they kept it so closely locked away, whatever everyone's making, to a point where if that information leaks, it would cause a catastrophic event in the company. And I think that just creates a lot of Pandora's boxes, and my job as a CEO, as a co-founder, shouldn't be to find enough treasures to lock away all that knowledge. I think my job is to be as transparent, as open, as literally at cap, at maximum. So it becomes a default, everyone's open, everyone's transparent. There's obviously business related information that you're not really letting out the door, which could harm your business or could like data, essentially, like if you're required to be compliant in certain laws, like we can't just publish everyone's birthday or something. No, but I think every information that can be public and your organization still survives, like there's no internal conflicts or there's no major, fuck ups. That's great because it's one less thing that I need to worry about. It's kind of like, when the biggest problem of liars is not the lying, it's the remembering who you lied to and what you actually lied, So if you're very open, very transparent, and very honest, and everything you do is based on the values of openness and transparency, it's a really fun life because you're not like, did I tell that? Did I tell this? Who did I like? Does this person know that person's salary? Is this one, So it becomes much more easy to navigate both the culture and just overall the company and the organization when everything it just becomes much easier to operate. But obviously that's not the main reason. The main reason is to push our values, the open sourceness.
So as we're nearing the end here, I'd love for you to tell the story behind changing to Cal.com process. I mean, what Calenso?
Calenso, yeah.
Was the name before?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mispronounced that in my head, so maybe that's why simplified names are good. So yeah, we just would love to talk about the thought process there, how you approached it, simplicity advantages, Calenso, what that even meant in the first place, basically the top line.
Calenso was a great side project. It was a great domain that I was able to get like off the registry. It was not pre-owned by someone. I could just register calenso.com. It had its, I'd say, pros. There was a unique name. It was not a word that was defined before or used before. But then as you just prove the point, not everyone was able to pronounce it immediately correctly or something. So I think that is a major benefit to rebrand to cal.com because we've been using cal as an abbreviation for calendar since I think calendars existed. I mean, at least I was doing that and a few others that I've talked to. So like, hey, can you find time in my cal that sounds natural, like it just goes with the flow, or here's my cal, or book my cal, or my cal is full, so it really works in that regard. But I think for us the most interesting or the most important reason to rebrand was as you said, the simplicity of sharing the link. So it's a bit of ergonomics, where if you go from 8 letters, which is Calenso, down to 3 letters, you're saving like 60% of letters. And 60% of letters also means 60% less typing. It means 60% faster sending. That your calendar, if you type in cal.com/peer, that's literally like a second or two versus 3 or 4 or 5 seconds. So if I'm someone who does a lot of bookings, I personally see the benefit, even though it's just 5 letters less. I already see the benefits of that. So I think that's just great because our job, our mission is to make scheduling more efficient, accessible, and drive that adoption. And with that amazing brand, we're not only getting better brand authority over the market, but also just it's one of the weird rebrands where it's actually core part of the product too. Like if a company that I don't really care about changes their name, doesn't really improve my product, like my use of the product. But for us, it actually did. It made everyone's link shorter. It saves everyone time and makes it more memorable and shareable. So yeah, I'm really, really grateful how everything turned out with that acquisition.
Okay, that's so interesting, that last bit, because there's a buy now, pay later service I used that rebranded itself. And I was kind of wondering, why do they pick this name? It doesn't appear to be any better. It's kind of random, but you actually, as you just said, you found a name that is easier and is clearer. Do you have any generic advice for founders considering rebrands?
I mean, generic. So for us, we wouldn't have bought the domain if we weren't in the link sharing business. I mean, it's part of the business to share your link, right? If we were, let's say, a dating app and our core product would live in the app store, we would probably get away with a catchy name, like an app name that's memorable, but you may not own that .com domain. Maybe, let's call it Meetly. Let's say you make a Tinder app, like a Tinder alternative, and you call it Meetly. You're probably not getting meetly.com because that's used by some, I don't know, or it may be too expensive, but you could probably rank on that keyword in the app store if it's memorable, short, and people use it. In fact, I think Tinder didn't even have Tinder when they started out, Tinder.com, sorry. So they didn't, I think they bought the domain afterwards. So I think for rebranding, I've ran some of the worst named businesses, which is called Snapcardster. It's 12 letters. You couldn't even write it down if I said it. And it was a mixture of, it was a Magic the Gathering business. So it was like a reference from the trading card game, but then like one word was changed. So it would refer to snapping a card, and then it's a mess. So I went from 12letters.com to Cal, which is, probably one of the most premium, there's not many 3-letter domains out there to buy anyway. So in that regard, it's probably one of the most unique names out there. And it's, at the end of the day, it's all about being memorable. If you find a way to make, Spotify, that was not a word, but it's very memorable. Mm-hmm. So, Shopify. I mean, it's also very memorable. I think that's something which I would always focus on. And my last advice is that yes, .com is most likely always worth it. I don't think we would have seen our traction now with the rebranding if it was cal.io or cal.ai or cal.me. Just because it just gives you authority and brand recognition and it's just trust, And the funny thing is, so .com, we're on the web. .com is the default. If you ever forget the domain ending from a brand, you put in cal.com, right? So if I forget if I know a service by name, let's say SendGrid, and I remember someone told me about SendGrid, and I go on in the address bar, I put in SendGrid.com. I'm not putting in SendGrid.io or SendGrid.me or SendGrid.app. It's always .com. It's always the default. It's so burned into our brains that I think it's always worth the the premium for that rebranding. So that combined with the memorability, if you can't find, let's say, meetly.com, maybe go for meetlyhub.com or meetlyhq.com, or I'm actually not a big fan of let's meet or try meet or join meet, because the problem is you want in your browser, you want to have your brand domain start with a brand name, because if you I navigate open tab T goes to Twitter, T Twitter, or Y YouTube, or G Google. If you compete with try and join and go, you rank in the list of all the other joins and tries and meets and lets, right? So that's something I'm not a big fan of. I'd rather go with HQ or base or something else that you can put at the end. But yeah, that's kind of my 101 on domains and branding.
So for our last one-on-one question, or 101 question, how do you advise for news you can use people who are listening manage their calendars? My calendar is a disaster, so I'm hoping for...
Yeah, it's a good point.
Producer Jackson, who's listening and has to deal with this, is also wondering how I can fix my terrible calendar too.
Yeah. There's two things that I would say is important. Knowing which schedule you're on. Like, are you like, it's a common word, but like, are you on a manager schedule or on a maker schedule? And the manager schedule is fairly condensed. You have a lot of meetings, a lot of check-ins, a lot of day-to-day things you need to take care of. So you have a fairly busy calendar. But the maker schedule probably has like only 2 or 5 events per week, right? And that's probably checking with the team, checking with investors, or checking with someone else. And then you have focus time to be doing your most important work. I like to switch back and forth, like really take out a week or 2 weeks where I'm only doing like the manager schedule, let's say fundraising or, very important, like for the launch, for example, like everything leading up to the launch. I use a plugin called Clockwise, which is also used by OnDeck to put in focus time into your calendar. It has a bit of AI. I don't really know if it's good or bad, but like at least it blocks out time on my calendar. It just puts it as busy. That helped me a lot to not be overbooked. And then the last thing I recommend is we have a feature at Cal where it's called opt-in bookings. So if someone ever leaks your link, let's say you get Marshall, cal.com/Marshall, and someone leaks that link or someone just without your consent books you, right? They book you next Monday. I've done the research with every other scheduling product out there, you would get an entry in your calendar. So you would need to cancel that one and maybe even apologize or say, hey, sorry, I can't make it or whatsoever, like, because it's rude. You just don't cancel someone, For the opt-in bookings, you have a middle layer. You have a dashboard where all the new bookings come in and they give you a small blurb of why you should meet them. So, and then you can confirm a meeting or reject a meeting. If you reject the meeting, you can add a reason saying like, hey, can we take this async over iMessage or over email, or here's a link to the resource that you're looking for. So it's a much more elegant way of actually protecting your calendar. And the benefit is you can actually publicly share your link, your booking link, without being afraid that people just DOS your calendar,
Mm-hmm.
Like DOS in a sense, they just put in like every day is booked. Because you're in charge, you can decide opt in, no, reject, confirm, reject. And that's a feature I'm really happy about that we've launched fairly early because it was a bit of peace of mind for myself. So I have a bit of protection for people who just, constantly want to, hey, let's jump on a 15-minute Zoom call. Like, can you just give me a bit of, intel? Maybe I can point you to the right person without a video call or something.
Thanks for joining us in the deep end. If you enjoyed your stay, give us a review on Apple Podcasts and share this episode with your friends and colleagues to help grow the show with us. We've also got show notes and more episodes available at ideas.beyonddeck.com. See you next time.